Good evening, everybody. It is Steve with Real Progressives. We're going to talk about hyperinflation tonight. The reason? Because it just won't go away, right? So hyperinflation is probably one of the most misunderstood phenomenons, and it is a phenomenon. This is not a regular occurrence by any stretch of the imagination. And it takes an awful lot of different factors to bring about a hyperinflationary situation. So what I've done is I've picked two different articles that I'm going to read tonight in between my own personal editorializing and opining. One is from The Atlantic, talking about the hyperinflation hype. And these are not MMT people, but they give a fairly decent explanation of all the different flavors of hyperinflation. Some of these explanations maybe are not 100% right, but they're close enough, so I feel confident reading them, and I can fill in the gaps where they are. The other one is from the great Bill Mitchell. And I think that when you hear the MMT angle on this, and you understand from one of the original developers, I think it will help set your mind at ease. And if not, it will get you thinking more, and it will make you dig deeper to learn even more. So let's strap in, and let's go with hyperinflation. Here we go. So this first article is in The Atlantic. And, for those of you who read these sorts of things, I think that, you probably know a lot of this stuff. But for many people, they haven't bothered to read this. And that's okay. Let's be fair. Big word like hyperinflation is meant to put coal in your stocking at Christmas time. It's the boogeyman. It's scary. And, we see instances of it in Venezuela, and we hear about Zimbabwe and Weimar Republic and all these other places. And in fairness, there's a situation in each of them that is dramatically different from the conditions that exist here in the United States. So chances are, unless some radical situation happens that I can't foresee, probably no one could foresee, we're not going to have a hyperinflation. So let's go into this. Hyperinflation hype. Why the U.S. can never be Weimar. And this is by Matthew O'Brien. And it says, U.S. government finances might look like Zimbabwe-esque, but a look back at some of the history's worst hyperinflation episodes show why Goldbug's fears are completely unfounded now. So there's a specter haunting our economic debate, the specter of hyperinflation. A depressing number of arguments the past few months and years can be reduced to the following exchange. We need more stimulus. If we keep spending, we'll just end up like Greece. Greece is mostly in trouble because they can't print their own money. Great, you want to print money and end up like the Weimar Republic? So, fears of hyperinflation in the United States are almost certainly unfounded. I don't say that because I can see the future, but rather because we all can see the past. Countries that have suffered the pain of a worthless currency share very little with the United States. Here's a financial disaster tour of recent history's worst hyperinflation episodes in descending order that suggest we shouldn't lose much sleep about the dollar becoming worthless. Hyperinflation History 101, Hungary, 1945 to 1946. Weimar Germany and Zimbabwe have both captured our popular imagination when it comes to money printing ad absurdum, but post-war Hungary has both of them beat by many orders of magnitude. Indeed, on an annual basis, Hungary's peak inflation rate was over 10 bazillion times more severe than Weimar's. Prices in Hungary doubled every 15 hours. Hungary turned to the printing press, with such unparalleled gusto because they thought the alternative was much worse. The war had destroyed nearly half of Hungary's productive capacity. Very important there, productive capacity. Basic infrastructure had quite literally been obliterated. The government wanted to rapidly rebuild this lost capacity and put people back to work. but it couldn't afford to do so. The occupying Soviets had burdened the Hungarians both with onerous reparations, this will become a recurring theme, and the bill for the occupation. Hungary was left with a colossal government deficit and no way to finance it. They printed the difference. Now, folks, when we're talking about here is debt denominated in a foreign currency, and we're also talking about a complete and utter decimation of their productive capacity of their entire economy, their entire nation, had nothing really to do with actually printing money. There was at least some kind of logic at work here. Even absent any printing, the large-scale destruction from the war meant that inflation was going to jump up. There were simply fewer goods for money to chase, which is a totally, it's not so much that there's too much money chasing too few goods, so much as there were shortages. Shortages because of the war and because their productive capacity to meet demand had been severely diminished. So if inflation was going to surge anyway, why not at least use it to repair the country's bombed-out infrastructure? Short answer, because printing money to pay your bills quickly spirals out of control. In Hungary's case, this happened to the tune of an annual inflation rate of 9.63 times 10 to the 26 power percent. Folks, you realize that before they ever quote-unquote printed any money, they had already entered into their inflation, their hyperinflationary situation. The hyperinflation happened long before the first penny was printed. It's very important to understand this. All the productive capacity is what caused the problem. It had nothing to do with printing the money. The printing the money happened after the hyperinflation began. Okay? Zimbabwe, 2007 to 2009. Unlike most hyperinflation, Zimbabwe wasn't the consequence of war or revolution. It was a self-inflicted. In 2000, the Mugabe government broke up the mostly white-owned farms that formed the backbone of the nation's agricultural sector into smaller ones. As a matter of social policy, trying to undo the enduring inequities of the colonial era made sense. As a matter of economic policy, however, it was suicidal. Foreign capital fled. The farms themselves were horrendously mismanaged. Years of drought didn't help either. Zimbabwe's economy promptly collapsed, which, of course, worsened the government deficit. Mugabe turned to the printing presses. The world's first $100 trillion bill was born. Now, first of all, another thing, same exact thing. Shortages. Again, massive productive capacity lost. Long before the printing of money. Do we understand this? This is stuff that you must understand, because the people who say, what are you going to do, just print more money, are failing even the most basic understanding of hyperinflation. Once again, the hyperinflation occurred before any printing of money occurred. All right. Weimar Germany, 1922 to 23. The economic consequences of the Versailles Treaty were dreadful. The political consequences were worse, even before you knew who took power. German reparations after World War I were both economically impossible and politically fantastical. The treaty's unexpectedly savage terms shocked the Germans. They were determined to highlight how absurd the treaty was by conspicuously failing to make their payments, and fail they did. In 1923, the Allies decided to force payment at the end of a gun barrel. They occupied Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley, setting the stage for Germany's final descent into monetary madness. German workers responded to the occupation with a general strike. The economy ground to a halt. Just about the only people still working were the ones manning the printing presses. The Weimar government had previously sent inflation to eye-popping levels by having its central bank foot its bills. But the combination of money printing and the so-called passive resistance to the rural occupation changed the nature of the inflation. It became virulent. As it turns out, printing money and pretending to have a real economy when you don't actually have a real economy doesn't work. Now, let me explain this to you. They get part of this right and a lot of it wrong. So, yes, the Treaty of Versailles was cruel and it was destructive. But the thing was that the debt payments were not just in the German Reichsmark. They were actually being forced in gold. They were being forced to be French francs. So the Germans had debt denominated in a foreign currency. So their money couldn't pay those things off. And with the occupation of their productive capacity by the Allies, they had no way to meet demand. Again, shortage-based, resource-based destruction of the economy before any printing of money occurred. Is this crystal clear yet? It's starting to, right? The way they say this in here, unfortunately, they're trying to act like, oh, they just went ahead and printed money too. And yeah, you know what? They didn't have a real economy, but that's bullshit. The problem is that the German people were stuck paying debt in foreign currencies. That's the problem. They were stuck with their productive capacity completely decimated. Again, the real problem is shortages, political corruption, and major upheaval. The next one, Bolivia, 1985 to 86. Too much foreign borrowing can be risky. Hey, foreign debt story coming up. Overseas lenders might abruptly decide that they've been irrationally exuberant. They'll call in their loans overnight, leaving the borrower starved for cash. Now, folks, for a country like the United States, we don't borrow money from anyone, ever. We print our own money, as they say. But more importantly, though, we issue our own money. We don't just print money. That's a gold standard relic, and we don't do it. That's not how it works. But more to the point, the United States government doesn't take on foreign debt. When we sell bonds, when we sell treasuries, and foreign countries purchase them, they purchase them with their existing U.S. dollars. All the debt associated with it is paid in U.S. dollars. There is no foreign debt. We do not borrow Chinese yuan. We don't borrow Japanese yen. We don't borrow Australian dollars. We don't borrow like that. That doesn't happen. That's not how it works. So end of story there, right? I hope so. Anyway, they say too much foreign borrowing. And when you think about these developing countries that don't have access to resources outside of their country, they don't have access to resources within their country. In other words, they're dependent on other countries to provide them goods and services because they can't produce them themselves. They have not got the productive capacity to meet demand. So what happens? They have to borrow foreign currencies to pay foreign debts, and this is what ends up happening. They have to find a way to make money. More importantly, have to find a way to pay foreign debt. And it's not always easy when you don't have the real resources to exchange for it. Think about the IMF going into these third world countries and making them an offer they can't refuse. And all of a sudden, the neoliberals go in and carve up their country. Look at Greece. These are things that happen for real, for real. So anyway, they go through this whole thing about leaving the borrower starved for cash. Economists call this a sudden stop. It's what happened in Mexico, Thailand, and Korea in the 90s. It's what happened to Greece, Portugal, and Ireland after the Great Recession. First things first, that's horseshit. So in the EU, the countries that no longer had the ability, the sovereign ability to pay their own debts using their own money, creating their own currency, they went over to the euro. The euro is not a state currency. It is the region's currency run by the Troika and the European Union or the European Central Bank, the ECB. When those folks don't have money, when they can't pay their bills, they don't just have the ability to break out drachma. They gave up the drachma. They gave up their monetary sovereignty. They, in turn, now are stuck. borrowing foreign currency because the euro is not their normal currency. It's like a state, like the state of, let's look at Detroit, Michigan. Or let's look at any number of cities that have gone bankrupt in America. We don't have states with their own quote-unquote sovereign currency. They use the U.S. dollar. Only the federal government can spend that money into existence. States have to tax, and they have to get bonds, and they have to go ahead and try to find investments, and they have to do a whole host of things to lure business in, to earn more tax dollars, etc. But the federal government doesn't have that problem. And Greece wouldn't have had that problem either if it didn't give up its monetary sovereignty and go over to the euro. Anyway, scrolling back here. Bolivia spent the 1970s borrowing large sums from abroad. In other words, foreign debt once again. This wasn't a problem as long as its foreign creditors were willing to roll over their loans, and they were willing to do so until the 80s. Then things changed. Bolivia's slowing exports scared away its lenders. In other words, the real resources that were backing up their loans. Suddenly, Bolivia had to start paying back its mountain of debt. Monetary sovereignty, folks. When you are a country that doesn't have the ability to take care of itself, and you have to go out and borrow because you can't afford to pay for the services you need, the goods and services you need, this creates a real challenge. Pegging your currency to a foreign currency, pegging it to a commodity, very, very risky business, folks. Very, very risky business. Bolivia couldn't afford to pay back its foreign creditors and spend on its own people. The government decided that the easiest way to prioritize was not to prioritize. Rather than cutting spending or hiking taxes, austerity, they would pay for everything thanks to the magic of the printing press. Now see, that's all fine and well. What they fail to understand is the role of monetary sovereignty. This is the most ridiculous part of these articles. But this is what most people will read. And this does say a lot of good things. But it says just enough bad that you may as well not read it. But I'm going to read it anyway because I want you all to understand what the current flavor of the day is. Anyway, more currency chasing the same amount of stuff makes the money worth less. See, this is another bullshit story right here. It's got nothing to do with more money. What it has to do with is the fact that there's not enough stuff to meet demand. So in other words, let's say hypothetically, we give everyone free health care. Do you think it's the printing of money that would cause inflation? Or do you think it's the fact that maybe we didn't do a transition and have enough doctors, nurses, hospitals, you name it? So now, instead of having enough supply to meet demand, what you have is a situation where everybody, forget the dollars, they could only have $1. They could have 50 cents. They could have a nickel. Everybody only has that. And it wouldn't matter. At the end of the day, there's still only enough gurneys, only enough hospital beds, only enough hospitals, x-ray machines, etc., to satisfy a smaller number than needs it. And that's the problem. That's when you hit a situation. It's got nothing to do with the amount of money in circulation. It's got to do with the fact that there's a lot of people that want a service, and that service isn't available for everyone. That's the problem. So the answer, it's not about printing money or not printing money. It's about getting the real resources to meet the demand. So hyperinflation isn't always just a matter of government incompetence. It's a matter of desperation. It typically begins with an economic implosion. War and revolution are usual suspects, or in Zimbabwe's case, an ill-advised land reform. The economic collapse begets a collapse in tax revenues. Folks, this tax revenue thing only matters at the state level. The federal government doesn't have such problems. The currency issuing sovereign doesn't have such problems. Perversely, this makes the government look like a terrible credit risk. Governments don't need to borrow from banks. The government creates its own money if it is monetarily sovereign. If a country has given up its monetary sovereignty or is a state like Texas or Maryland or, I don't know, California, then that's a totally different story. But a currency issuing nation such as China, Russia, Japan, Canada, Australia, the UK, they don't have these problems. They maintain and own their sovereign currency. And no, Australia doesn't have a standing world army defending the petrodollar, nor does Japan, nor does Canada. And yet they all are monetarily sovereign and can do all kinds of good stuff with their money. And they're not having hyperinflation because they don't have these problems. These problems are few and far between, and they usually happen from crazy, crazy situations. Perversely, this makes the government look like a terrible credit risk, cut off from international lenders. International lenders. The United States government doesn't care about international lenders, nor does Russia, nor does China, nor does Australia, nor does Canada, nor does the UK. None of them care about external creditors because they are monetarily sovereign. Cut off from international lenders, the government is left with a gaping hole in its budget and no way to fill it. The choice is between pain today from austerity or pain tomorrow from printing money. Another trip right here. This is a big pile of bullshit. Big pile of bullshit. Why? Because the choice of austerity doesn't save the government money. The government creates money out of thin air. And the pain for tomorrow from printing money is only if there aren't real resources. And the real resources will be there because what business doesn't want to make more sales? It's preposterous. It gets worse. These governments usually have piles of foreign debt to pay off. Yes, now they're in the right spot. They have foreign debt to pay off, not treasury bonds bought in U.S. dollars, paid back in U.S. dollars as savings accounts, like the U.S. government's national debt or the Japanese national debt, etc. But actual foreign debt where they're saying we can't afford to feed our people. We need to get food from you and we need your currency to purchase it. Now we have to pay you back in your currency, which means somehow or another, we've got to go out on the market and get your currency to pay your debt back, which means we have to have the real resources or something to acquire that foreign currency because they don't have the ability to create that currency. It's the other government's national currency, and they do have the ability to do that. The IMF is a big old neoliberal clusterfuck led by the United States government to strong-arm its will across the globe. That's the IMF, and it puts these terrible positions on small countries that have no ability to pay back this stuff, and it imposes austerity on them, and it makes them far worse than they were before they ever got the help from the IMF. So, of course, we all know how the story ends. Much, much, much money chasing much fewer goods sends prices into the stratosphere. I'm going to finish that one off for them as well. Whenever there is a scarcity of whatever it is, food, electricity, gasoline, whatever, doesn't matter how much money is chasing it. What matters is that there are more people that want that good or service, and there isn't enough of it to go around, and people will do whatever it takes to be the one that gets it, especially when you're talking about something like fuel that keeps you warm, that powers your car, whatever. And this is the genesis of hyperinflation, not printing too much money, not too many dollars chasing too few goods. Has nothing to do with the dollar supply. It has to do with the number of people that want a given product or service, the resource, and the scarcity of said resource. And that chase drives it. Don't even talk to me about printing money. It's not the cause. So how are the United States' historic budget deficits, money printing, and depressed economy any different from the countries that have experienced hyperinflation? The three-part answer is we don't have any problems selling our debt. Not an issue. We don't care about that. That's bullshit once again. All the national debt is when it comes to selling these treasury bonds is to defend a positive interest rate at the Fed. It has nothing to do with financing our government. Imagine this. We want to go to war. We want to bomb Syria, or we want to bomb Iran, or we want to bomb Iraq. And then all of a sudden you look on the ledger and you realize that Syria owns a lot of U.S. debt. And then you look and say Iran owns U.S. debt as well. And then you look and see Russia owns tons of U.S. debt, but Russia and U.S. are going to go to war? Interesting. So Russia is financing war against themselves? How quaint. Bullshit. It's crazy. Don't think it. Don't believe it. It ain't true. Okay? So, I read this now with another eye, and I'm like wondering, sometimes I wonder, why am I reading this? Well, the reason I'm reading this is because people genuinely will read this, lap it up, and they will come running around saying that inflation is brought on by too many dollars chasing too few goods. And it really doesn't have next to anything to do with the amount of money out there. It has to do with the relative buying power of a lot of people that have a need or a desire. The alternative is, if people have desire for health care and they have the money to buy the health care, but there's not enough doctors, well, guess what? Health is going to go up because people want to live. Is it because there's too much money and those dumb people wanted to live? No. It's because there's not enough doctors to perform the tasks that they need. What would a government do in that case if it was smart? Oh, I don't know. Incentivize getting more frickin' doctors. Has nothing to do with the printing of money. Nothing. Goodness, nothing. Anyway, second, we aren't actually printing money. That's true. We aren't actually printing money. They got something right there. We keystroke it. And the United States is a highly productive economy that is nothing like the bombed out Budapest. Now that's true. But the United States economy, we're a net importer, aren't we? We're getting a lot of goods and services brought into the United States. I think we have about a $500 billion a year annual trade deficit. The current account balance is always tipped to the side of being an importer. So why are we able to import? Why are we able to keep things down? Well, naturally because the petrodollar, right? No. It's because the United States has vast real resources. We've made a decision to buy imports because we don't want to disturb our natural resources. We want to maintain those. And so it's cheaper and we go out. So where does that leave workers? Well, the average person says they're outsourcing our jobs to all around the country. Reality is, so what we could do with that is invest on infrastructure in the United States and domestic spending. And let them around the world that want to twist the ties on a Tootsie Pop, twist the ties on a Tootsie Pop. Let us get into the service work. Let us rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. Let us get a brand new green energy grid that will create millions of jobs. I don't need to twist the ties on a Tootsie Pop, my friends. I don't need to bring that job back. Anyway, the last one. The United States is a highly productive economy. Is nothing. It's true, yes. So let me unpack these one by one. Right now, the markets, you know what? I read this, and there's not much left, but I can tell you right now, the average thing that I'm about to read here is so pathetic that I almost can't do it with a straight face. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move to Bill Mitchell's article, Zimbabwe for Hyperventilators 101. And this is an MMT perspective. Hopefully, this will answer a lot of questions. This is a tough read at some level. Bill's got a unique style for writing, but a lot of this is really straightforward. And I think that if you get a chance, we'll put the links in the narrative. Please go ahead and read this on your own, slowly, whatever you want. But this is an important article. So let me get on to it. Here we go. So Zimbabwe is the new Weimar Republic. Not. Zimbabwe is the frontline evidence that shows that government deficits will generate hyperinflation. Not. Zimbabwe is the demonstration of the folly of fiat monetary system. Not. Zimbabwe is an African country with a dysfunctional government. Yes. First, we should make sure what we're talking about. The right thinks that when workers get a pay raise, it is inflation. It's not. The left thinks that when corporate sector increase the price of good or service, it is inflation. It's not. It is also not inflation when the exchange rate falls, pushing the price of imports up a step. It is also not inflation when the government increases a particular tax, say the GST, by X% to some new level. So while a price rise is an essential precondition, a necessary condition for what we call inflation, it is not a sufficient condition. That is, the observation of a price rise will be required to define an episode as being inflationary at some point. But observing a price rise alone will not be sufficient to categorize the phenomena that you are observing as being an inflationary episode. Inflation is the continuous rise in price level. That is, the price level has to be rising each period that you observe it. So if the price level of a wage level increases by 10% or 10% every month, then you have an inflationary episode. In this case, the inflation rate would be considered stable, a constant rise per period. If the price level was rising by 10% a month, 1, then 11% in month 2, then 12% in month 3, and so on, then you have an accelerating inflation. Alternatively, if the price level was rising by 10% in month 1, 9% in month 2, then you have a falling or decelerating inflation. If the price level starts to continuously fall, then we call that a deflationary episode. Hyperinflation is just inflation big time. So a price rise can become inflation, but it is not necessarily inflation. Many commentators and economists get this basic understanding wrong, often and continually. Second, it also follows that the cyclical adjustments in price levels by firms from what they are currently offering at depressed levels of activity to what the price levels that are defined at their normal operating capacity levels are also not sensible to consider as inflation. When the economy is in poor shape, firms cut prices in an attempt to increase capacity utilization by temporarily suppressing their profit margins, and hence maintain market share. As demand conditions become more favorable, the firms start increasing the prices they offer until they get back to those levels that offer them the desired rate of return at normal capacity utilization. Have you tried hiring hotel accommodation recently in the tourist areas? Big discounts are on offer, but they will disappear once the economy improves. It is not helpful to call that inflation. Responsible fiscal practice. Now, at the risk of repeating myself a million times, this is the macroeconomic sequence that defines responsible fiscal policy practice. This is basic macroeconomics, and the debt deficit hyperinflation hyperventilating neoliberal terrorists seem unable to grasp it. Wow, I like that. Bill Mitchell has just got away with it, doesn't he? Let's read that again, shall we? Now, at the risk of repeating myself a million times, this is the macroeconomic sequence that defines responsible fiscal policy practice. This is basic macroeconomics, and the debt deficit, hyperinflation, hyperventilating neoliberal terrorists seem unable to grasp it. Now, are you a neoliberal terrorist unable to grasp it? Are you? Number one, the sovereign government, which is not revenue constrained because it issues the currency, has a responsibility for seeing that the workforce is fully employed. 2, full employment means that less than 2% unemployment, 0 underemployment, and 0 hidden unemployment. The sovereign government can purchase any real good or service that is available for sale in the market at any time. It never has to finance this spending, unlike a household which uses the currency issued by the sovereign government. The household always has to finance its spending, as do state and local governments in the federal system. Let's read this again. Folks, let's read this again until we get it drilled into our skull cap, so that we don't have any brain dumps that resemble anything like a neoliberal. The sovereign government can purchase any real good or service that is available for sale in the market at any time. It never has to finance this spending, unlike a household which uses the currency issued by the sovereign government. The household always has to finance its spending, as do state and local governments in a federal system. That should be clear, right? Number 4, the non-government sector typically decides in aggregate to save a proportion of the income that is flowing to it. The desire to save motivates spending decisions, which result in the flow of spending being less than the income produced. If nothing else happened, then firms would reduce output and income would fall, as would employment, and households would find they were unable to achieve their desired saving ratio. This is a big one. I hope you got that. I'm going to read it again. The non-government sector, private sector, typically decides in aggregate, that means all of us, to save a proportion of the income that is flowing to it. This desire to save motivates spending decisions, which result in the flow of spending being less than the income produced. If nothing else happens, then firms would reduce output and income would fall, as would employment, and households would find they were unable to achieve their desired saving ratio. Folks, what we're talking about there is the beginnings of a recession. The government sector must, in this situation, fill the spending gap left by the non-government sector's decision to withdraw some spending in relation to its income. In other words, savings pulls money out of the economy, and at some point in time, the government has to fill back up what the non-government sector has retained. If the government does not increase its net contribution to spending, that is, run a budget deficit, up to the point that total spending now equals total income, then firms will realize their planned output sales and retain current employment levels. The government sector's, this is number 6, the government sector's net position, spending minus revenue, is the mirror image of the non-government's net position. Now, I wanted to say this real quickly. If you look at the sectoral balances graph that we often share, Stephanie Kelton is famous for this graph. It's all over the place. But this graph is so incredible because what it does is it shows you that the government's spending is another person's income. In general, spending is someone else's income. And so when you look at it, the spending on one side is high and the other side is low. So you have mirror images of spending and income. And you can look at the sectors. If it's the foreign sector, or if it's the public sector, or if it's the private sector. And you can see there's a mirror image because everything nets to zero. Spend here, someone's income there. The government doesn't hold cash in some vault. That's not how it works. When the government spends, it creates new money. When the government taxes, it deletes that money because it's done its job. It's a tax credit. It does the loop, comes back home. All right. So the government sector's net position, spending minus revenue, is the mirror image of the government's net position, the non-government's net position. So a government surplus equal dollar for dollar, cent for cent to a non-government deficit and vice versa. So if the non-government sector's in surplus, in other words, us, and corporations and anything not the government, a net saving position, then income adjustments will render the government sector in deficit, whether it plans to be in that state or not. If income has fallen in the face of rising saving behavior of the non-government sector, and that spending gap is not filled by government net spending, then the budget deficit will rise as income adjustments cause tax revenue to fall and welfare payments to rise. You see that? That's a pretty big deal right there. If income is falling in the face of rising savings behavior in the non-government sector, and that spending gap is not filled by the government net spending, then the budget deficit will rise as income adjustments cause tax revenue to fall and welfare payments to rise. You end up with a deficit, but the economy is at a much less satisfactory position than it would have been the case if the government have financed the non-government sector saving desire in the first place and kept employment levels high. In other words, deficit spend. So a responsible government will attempt to maintain spending levels sufficient to fill any saving. You will note I have discussed this in broad aggregates, government, non-government, rather than taking the so-called leakages and injections approach, which decomposes the non-government sector into foreign and domestic and considers tax savings and import leakages against the government spending, investment and export injections. No particularly interesting things emerge at the level of aggregation which are relevant here. We get all the basic insights by keeping it simple. Getting causality right. If we think about the Weimar Republic for a minute, the problems for them began long before hyperinflation. Sounds familiar. Which really went off in 1923. Following World War I, the reparations payments required under Versailles Treaty squeezed the German government so badly they eventually defaulted. The treaty was just a bloody-minded payback by the victors of the war and brought so much subsequent grief to the world in the 1939 and 1945 war that you wonder what was going on in their heads. Anyway, for historians, you will recall that the French and Belgian armies then retaliated after the German default and took over the industrial area of Ruhr, Germany's mining and manufacturing heartland. The Germans in turn stopped work production, ground to a halt. The Germans kept paying the workers in the local currency despite limited production. Shortages, folks. Remember this, production issues right here. And they kept paying the workers in local currency despite limited production, the real resources being possible. And you can imagine the nominal demand quickly started to rise relative to real output, which was grinding to a halt. The crunch came when the export trade stalled, and the only way German government could keep paying their treaty obligations was to keep spending. The inflation followed. But think carefully about the causality here. It was not normal situation at all where a sovereign government was trying to finance the saving desire of the non-government sector and keep employment and output levels high. I sketched the following simple diagram for you to give you an idea what might go on when a severe supply shock contraction occurs. It's not perfect, but it makes the point. You have to impose your own dynamic motion on the chart. So here's the chart. I'm going to scroll back up there in a minute. Income spending, full capacity spending, revised potential output, initial potential output, real output, aggregate supply. And folks, I'm going to tell you straight up, I can't teach this. This is beyond me what we're talking about here in terms of the aggregates. I can understand it, but I'm not a teacher on this, and I'm not a teacher on any of this. I'm simply a messenger, and I'm trying to relay this to you as best as I can. So he says the horizontal axis is real output and full employment potential output is shown by the vertical green line inferring no bio-unsustainable production levels. The vertical axis is spending or demand in real terms. The trick is that the price level is held constant in the diagram. The 45-degree line is the fixed price aggregate supply curve, indicating that firms will supply whatever is demanded at the fixed price to capacity, point A. After point A, supply capacity would be exhausted and inflation would then enter the picture. So first things first, when people talk about MMT and they say it doesn't address inflation, well, I think we can all safely say that's a lie, right? The red line on top, which intersects point A, is the aggregate demand line and shows the current state of spending in the economy at different real income levels. It is an upward sloping because consumption rises with national income, and it is less than 45 degrees because not all income is consumed, some of it savings. So it is the sum of all demand components, consumption, investment, net exports, and government spending. If we assume that that Shangri-La prevails, then we are initially at point A. There will be full capacity output, stable prices, some non-government saving, and a budget deficit to match. Now imagine that some dictator comes along and starts taking land off the original farmers who were productive and gives it to those who do not understand how to farm or have no real interest in farming. In this primarily agricultural economy, the potential output would steadily contract. And I have shown a particular revised potential line, a contraction of the overall capacity of the economy to produce. If you think about current demand levels in relation to the new dramatically reduced supply potential, you quickly see there is a huge excess demand spending measured by the gap between point B and D. Let's go look at that real quick. Here's B and here's D, the excess demand. But in fact, the income levels fall. The economy would actually contract along the top red aggregate demand line. As income falls, so does consumption and savings. At point C, there is still excessive demand spending in relation to the new potential capacity. So demand would have to be reduced downward, red line shifting down, until it intersected the new supply constraint at the 45-degree line in point D. So here we go up here, point D, right here. It would need to be there. At point C, there is still excessive demand spending in relation to the new potential capacity. Point C could theoretically be associated just as much with a budget surplus as a budget deficit. That is, you cannot directly implicate the conduct of fiscal policy with the excess spending automatically or even necessarily. The upshot is that the price level would be rising in this economy long before it reached point D from point A because of the chronic excess spending relative to the dramatically lower capacity, aka production. Let's go back up here again. Folks, I suggest reading this article yourself, looking this over, and then bringing your questions into modern monetary theory for real progressives, where there will be economists in there that can answer your questions, and if they can't, we'll take it to them ourselves. Okay, so here we go. Zimbabwe. The hyperinventilators out there in debt deficit hysteria land have been increasing using Zimbabwe as their modern equivalent of the Weimar Republic, and as the frontline attack dog in their squawking campaign to get rid of deficits again. The problem is they clearly have not read much history nor analyzed Zimbabwe very well at all. It's obvious that the nice-colored Zimbabwe currency has steadily debased and been replaced by notes with more and more knots on the end of the one. In other words, zeros. So what went on? The Zimbabwean government is sovereign in the Zimbabwe dollar. Although recent decisions to allow U.S. dollars to freely trade within the economy is likely to undermine that sovereignty if tax collections in Zimbabwe dollars become difficult to achieve. In the same way that the Treaty of Versailles was directly responsible for the plight that Germany found itself during the 1920s, the white racist regime that ruled prior to 1980 and what had broken away from colonial arrangements with Britain set up the conditions that are now destroying Zimbabwe. White minority rule in colonial Africa created such an unfair sharing of land between the whites and the blacks that a backlash was always going to occur. The same sort of breakdown will threaten South Africa, which is trying to reinvent itself peacefully in the post-apartheid era. Not very successfully, may I add. Whites who constituted 1% of the population owned 70% or more of the productive land. After the Civil War of the 70s and the recognition of independence in the 80s, Mugabe's government more or less oversaw relatively improved growth with stable enough inflation outcomes. In this World Bank report 1995, you see the data shows that the economic performance was variable but reasonable. The economy underwent a severe drought in 92-93, which pushed the inflation rate up, but it soon came back to usual levels. The following graph is of GDP growth. Since independence in 1980 to 2007, data from the IMF, the performance is up until about 2000 provided no sign of the disaster that has followed. GDP growth looked to be like many other nations, variable and usually positive, except for the harsh drought of 92-93. Another resource constraint, right? The problems came after 2000 when Mugabe introduced land reforms to speed up the process of equality. This is a situation of just transition, right? When you just sort of do things and you don't plan them out, bad things happen. Get your PMP. In any event, the problems came after 2000 when Mugabe introduced land reforms to speed up the process of equality. It is a vexed issue, really. The reaction to the stark inequality was understandable, but not very sensible in terms of maintaining an economy that could continue to grow and produce at a reasonably high levels of output and employment. I want you to think about that. Think about every time people talk about slashing and cutting spending on their favorite or hated area of our government, whether it be the military or some other thing. Without replacing that spending, you create a situation like this. And ultimately, whenever you create those shortages, you create recessions, you create pain and suffering. There's got to be a transition. There's got to be a well thought out transition. Otherwise, you end up with terrible misery and pain every time. That's why the whole burn it down thing is just hogwash. Most people are willing to write checks for other people's lives that they're not willing to back up with their own life. And it's very important that we understand what a just transition is so that we don't have a Zimbabwe situation in our own backyard. Not that we would, but it could happen if the wrong people that didn't understand economics decided to start making really boneheaded populist decisions that are not rooted in economic literacy. When those sorts of things happen, bad things happen to good people. So, the revolutionary fighters that gained Zimbabwe's freedom from the colonial masters were allowed to just take over productive white-owned commercial farms, which had hitherto fed the population and was the largest employer. So the land reforms were, in my view, not well implemented, but correctly motivated. Great motivation, piss-poor output. Like the Allies after Versailles, sometimes you do not get what you wish for. The whites in Zimbabwe had always been reluctant to share with the majority blacks and ultimately reap the nasty harvest they sowed. From an economic perspective, though, the farm takeover and the collapse of food production was catastrophic. So let's put this in perspective. This is like eat the rich. You want to eat the rich because that's what we want to do. It's motivated by the pain and suffering and so forth. But the real deal is you really want to take care of the people. And when you decouple eating the rich from taking care of the people, and you realize that you can take care of the rich, or take care of the people, I should say, and screw the rich, push them away, ignore them, you can solve the crisis of the people, and then you can go after the rich. But unfortunately, we can't convince regular people that the rich people aren't the reason why they don't have nice things. It's because the currency issuing government has chosen not to spend on the people. Look at them wringing their hands over Medicare for all. Look at them wringing their hands over student debt cancellation. Look at them wringing their hands over free college. Look at them wringing their hands over paid family and medical leave. Look at them wringing their hands over a federal job guarantee. It's not an accident that they always seem to come up short when it comes to serving the public. Why? Well, because they want to create markets that the freaking private sector can gouge the regular people for. And that's the deal. Anyway, the situation then was compounded as other infrastructure was trashed and the constraints flowed through the supply chain. For example, the National Railways of Zimbabwe has decayed to the point that capacity to transport its mining export output has fallen substantially. In 2007, there was a 57% decline in export mineral shipments. See, they let the infrastructure break down, and now they can't even export their way out of the problem. Manufacturing was also roped into the malaise. The Confederation of Zimbabwe Industries, CZI, publishes various statistics which report on manufacturing capacity and performance. Manufacturing output fell by 29% in 2005, 18% in 2006, 28% in 2007. In 2007, only 18.9% of Zimbabwe's industrial capacity was being used. Major shortages. This reflected a range of things, including raw material shortages, but overall the manufacturers blamed the central bank for stalling their access to foreign exchange, which is needed to buy imported raw materials. Again, another supply issue. They have to take on foreign debt to be able to buy foreign things because they're a developing economy with very limited resources. Very specialized resources. They're an agricultural region. They don't have the real resources that a place like the United States has. Further, goods and services have also been prevented from flowing in via imports because many importers abandon goods at the border when they are hit by exorbitant import duties. So they put a big old tax on import duties, and people are like, screw that noise. How about it, guys? So taken together, the collapse of production has seen the unemployment raised to 80% or more. The rising unemployment has further choked any household income growth, and aggregate demand has fallen even further. A consequence, GDP growth has been contracting at 7 or 8% a year, and the economy's potential capacity level has been falling dramatically as investment dries up. Further, the response of the government to buy political favors by increasing its net spending without adding to the productive capacity was always going to generate inflation and then hyperinflation. Again, many people had huge needs. The resources were stripped away. The production was stripped away. You saw the numbers completely decimated. The quote-unquote printing of money without the subsequent production created the inflation and the hyperinflation. In other words, the printing of money and giving it to people without actually producing anything for that money is an inflationary event. It created the groundwork for hyperinflation. Now, I want you to think about what a UBI is. There's no output. There's no increased productivity. There's nothing real resource-wise for that. It's just cash. It's inflationary. But you can't make people realize this because they are religiously wed to the idea of a UBI. Is it shameful? No. Again, like Bill Mitchell says here, their motives are good. Their execution is abysmal. That's a UBI in a nutshell. You may want nice things. You may be thinking good things, but your idea is full of crap. Period. Sorry. I wish I could say it nicer. Probably could. Won't. It's about a job guarantee. Get the UBI crap out. We need to keep the productive capacity up for the currency to stay stable. All right. When you so comprehensively mismanage the supply side of your economy as Zimbabweans did, the only way to avoid inflation is to severely contract real spending to match the new lower capacity. Austerity. More people would have starved and died than have already if the government had cut back that severely. But this disaster has nothing to do with budget deficits as a means to ensure high levels of employment in a growing economy where capacity grows over time, where the non-government sector also desires to save. A private sector investment boom would have caused the same outcome both in inflation and political problems or fighting it. So will the hyperventilators also say we should not have net private investment? The historical context is important to understand because it created the political circumstances which have made the hyperinflation inevitable. The historical context is important to understand because it created the political circumstances which have made the hyperinflation inevitable. But these historical vestiges from the colonial white rule bear very little relevance to the situation that a modern, sophisticated fiat monetary system will face. Bill Mitchell concludes. So hyperventilate as you like, but Zimbabwe does not make a case against the use of continuous budget deficits in defense of full employment. Bad governments will wreck any economy if they want to. A wise government using the fiscal capacity provided to it by fiat money system can engender full employment and equity, yet also sustain price stability. Spread the word. Now, folks, so many people come to us saying, what are you going to do? Just print more money. The Green New Deal. Let's talk about the Green New Deal real quick. The Green New Deal leverages a federal job guarantee. Why does that matter? Because we're going to spend and we need to keep the productive capacity up. Also, because the regular people do not have anywhere to go if the economy implodes again, like it did in 2007, 8, and 9, when the global financial crisis really hit hard. And more importantly, though, Just like food stamps and other things that were subsidies to agriculture to ensure that the economy didn't tank. The federal job guarantee acts as a superior countercyclical stabilizer, automatic stabilizer. As the economy goes badly, people roll onto the job guarantee. They keep the productive capacity up. No hyperinflation. Way better than a UBI that is very, very neoliberal and makes you consumption units. And then when the economy improves, people can choose to stay in the job guarantee, which you'd like to believe would be set at a living wage with living benefits from the federal government. Or they can go out and find better work in a transitional fashion. As Warren Mosler calls it, it's a transition job where you'd be serving your local community. And the private sector has to meet or beat your wage. So when we look at things like a Green New Deal, it's not going to cause hyperinflation. There isn't any diminished capacity because what they're doing is they're spending to create the capacity. The real resources are there. We got to spend on it. The real thing is the hit line is full employment. We get to full employment. And let me tell you, the Green New Deal will get us to full employment, real legitimate full employment. And so all these other things that we're talking about, every last one of them is doable, provided we have the real resources to take care of it. And like I said when I was discussing it, when I was reading Bill's article, sectoral balances, the foreign, the public, and the private, the balance of those is really key to understanding, coupled with full employment, whether or not our nation has reached its point where it's saturated and should probably cut back on spending. But we're so far from that, it's not even funny. The other thing that they talked about was a decrease in prices. Warren Mosler talked about Medicare for All being a deflationary event. Inflation means prices are rising. Deflationary means prices are lowering. When you have a deflationary period, raising taxes is a silly thing to do. In other words, it may require a tax break, tax cut, by instituting Medicare for All. So it's kind of a head scratcher when you think why they're actually going to try to pay for it with taxes, huh? Regardless, deficit spending in and of itself in no way, shape, or form represents hyperinflation. The only thing that would cause hyperinflation, which isn't going to happen in the U.S., by the way, is a major shortage, foreign debt. Somehow or another, we can't produce what we need. And the United States has vast natural resources, productive capacity, and labor. So for those people that are always predicting the demise of the dollar and the demise of the... just stop. It's uneducated. It doesn't look good on you. And the answer is there for you if you choose to learn. And I suggest everybody take the time to learn, because this is how we progressives will be able to push for all the services that we require to bring about equality without destroying the economy and our environment. I'm Steve Grumbine with Real Progressives. I hope you learned something about hyperinflation tonight. I'm out.